Then, how much was Sarah's inheritance? Thomas's words took me by surprise. After Sarah, my mother's, funeral had ended, without a single word of concern for me, he said that, thinking perhaps the inheritance had been deposited since I was checking our bank account. But to say something like that, truly, is beyond what is human. About $1 million. $1 million? Is that all? Well, even after taxes, there should still be a few $100,000 left. Hesitantly, I responded, and Thomas laughed triumphantly under his breath as if he had won, upon hearing my words. What a disgusting smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things won't go as Thomas wishes. However, the next day, Thomas immediately put his idea into action. But this naive idea of his would eventually strip him of everything. Thomas is oblivious to that fact. My name is Elizabeth. I was married at the age of 20, through an introduction by our parents. My husband's name is Thomas. He is a company employee, 5 years my senior, and the eldest son. Though he says he's the eldest, his younger brother Matthew has estranged and left the house after graduating from college. Being essentially an only child, Thomas was dearly loved by his parents. Frankly, marrying Thomas was not my intention. However, my mother was from a family that had been running a business for generations, and I was considered a young lady of status. Therefore, I couldn't oppose what my parents had decided. And so, I ended up marrying Thomas, who also couldn't refuse me since his father was running a business as well. Our marriage wasn't based on mutual feelings. It was far from a happy marriage. To make matters worse, we couldn't have children. Since we married young, I couldn't easily give up on the idea of having children, thinking it might change our situation. But, no matter the hospital visits, things didn't go as planned.
Hey, Elizabeth! Is the cleaning done?
Margaret, my mother-in-law, who initially treasured me as a young lady, started treating me terribly after a few years. You shouldn't need to go to the hospital if you just did what you're supposed to. What a waste of money. Stephen, my father-in-law, would insult me daily. Yet, knowing my situation, Thomas never stood up for me. Next to me, being cornered by his parents, he would either be reading the newspaper lying down or taking naps, snoring away. Even when I expressed a desire to work for a change of pace, "You working would imply our business isn't doing well." And so, I wasn't allowed to leave the house. Indeed, at that time, it was common for women to become housewives after marriage. However, living with just Margaret was honestly hell every day. No one would help me. I couldn't trouble my parents with my concerns, and running away wasn't an option due to the marriage being business-related. Yet, I kept enduring, hoping things would eventually get better. But no matter the years, the situation never improved. 20 years into our marriage. When I turned 40, Stephen passed away in an accident. That triggered the revelation that Stephen's company had been evading taxes. With back taxes and fines, our assets were gone, properties seized, and the company bankrupt. A significant insurance sum placed on Stephen was also consumed in the process. Only the house remained, but our comfortable life had to be let go. I worried about Thomas, then 45, finding new employment, but my parents offered him a job. Thanks to them, he was quickly employed, but Margaret became a shell of her former self and aged rapidly. For a while, she lacked even the energy to insult me, which was a relief in a way, but then she had a stroke and required care. This situation made me realize that I no longer had the luxury to pursue treatments for pregnancy. Now 40. I was somewhat ready to give up, but this became the real turning point for surrender. Thomas, as if it were natural, left the care to me, spending his days off lying around as before. "Thomas, I wish you would help with Margaret's care once in a while." One day, I gathered my courage and told him that, even if he assisted with just one meal on his days off, it would be a huge help to me. But Thomas frowned upon hearing my words.
Huh? I'm working, you know. Let me rest on my days off.
Thomas must not understand that I essentially have no such thing as a day off. After Stephen's company went bankrupt and my parents started to worry, they finally told me I could come back home. But what would become of Margaret if I left now? Currently, we have a home health aide come once a week, but I doubt we have the money to hire one daily. Despite being mistreated and scorned, I couldn't bring myself to abandon her, it just wasn't in me. Thomas began leaving the house early, even on his days off. He said it was because my gaze was too harsh when he tried to relax on his days off.
My wife won't even let me relax at home on my days off,
I heard he started saying to our neighbors. And he seemed to be traveling alone. The neighbors knew Margaret required care. Despite that, Thomas would make statements that left all the caregiving to me. He probably doesn't possess the mindset to consider how his own words make him appear. It was pitiful that Thomas, once so fond of Margaret, stopped coming to her the moment she became unwell.
You being here is why Thomas doesn't come.
Sometimes I was told that, but when I asked, "Should I leave then?" she would immediately fall silent. After enduring such a life for another 20 years, the long caregiving period ended, and Margaret finally joined Stephen. I was about to turn 60. There was no love left for Thomas. I had resigned myself to many things. Leaving now seemed impossible. I was likely to spend the rest of my life in this house. Thomas was serious about his work, at least. He was valued for that, and even as we approached 60, he was requested to continue working as a senior staff member. The fact that I can live on because of that is undeniable. Though we were never close as a couple, I am grateful for that aspect. Our relationship was not good, but Thomas never tried to kick me out. He probably thinks it's too late for anything now. He still doesn't want to stay home on holidays, so he leaves, and I enjoy my time alone. I've even taken up pottery as a hobby recently. At this age, I've made friends, and for the first time since getting married, I'm experiencing enjoyable days. But Thomas seems to dislike this.
You're out enjoying yourself while I'm working,
he said one day, burning the bag I used for pottery classes in the yard.
What are you doing? Don't get obsessed with weird hobbies, just do your housework.
The bag contained pottery materials and my toolbox. Even pouring water on it was too late, it turned to ashes. I was truly angry. I thought it was too late for changes, but there's still a long way to go. Divorce crossed my mind. But as I contemplated this, more misfortune came my way. It was the sudden departure of my parents. My father, Charles, passed away suddenly from illness, and a month after his funeral, my mother, Sarah, fell ill and followed him. It was so sudden that I was engulfed in sadness. My brother, Donald, had already taken over my father's company, but the funeral for both my mother and father saw many visitors. Combining the busyness of the funerals, I ended up bedridden for about a week afterward. It must have been mental exhaustion. My pottery class friends reached out, concerned, but Thomas was the only one.
How long will you be sleeping? I was shocked and tired after Mom's funeral too, but I didn't sleep that much. It must be nice for someone who doesn't work to sleep in.
To mock me. It might be a valid point, but as words from a husband to his wife, they score 0. From the next day, I forced my heavy body up and returned to my usual routine. Albeit just the bare minimum for living, as I wasn't yet up for enjoying hobbies. Thomas, uncaring of my feelings, seemed satisfied. Then, some time after my mother's funeral, I remembered that the deadline for the funeral home payment was approaching. so I was looking over our bank account. Donald was busy with work, so I had promised to handle the transfer on his behalf. However, unaware of this, Thomas, seeing me with the bank account information, approached me with a nasty grin.
So, how much was Sarah's inheritance?
His words shocked me deeply. After my mother's funeral, without a single word of concern for me, he had said that. He must have thought the inheritance had been deposited since I was looking at the bank account information. But surely, that's beyond what a person should do. I answered listlessly.
About $1 million. $1 million? Is that all? But well, after taxes, there's still a few $100,000 left.
Thomas muttered under his breath, laughing triumphantly. What a disgusting smile. I don't know what he's thinking, but things won't go as Thomas wishes. Without saying anything to Thomas, I quietly cleaned up. Perhaps realizing I wouldn't say anything, Thomas finally sensed it.
Well, you've had a tough time too. Get some rest early today.
Awkwardly, Thomas offered these unusually kind words. Far from being happy, it only made me feel worse. Not because Thomas told me to, but simply because I couldn't stand to look at him anymore. I went to bed early that day. However, the next day, an incident occurred. As usual, Thomas went to work after breakfast. But there was a call saying Thomas hadn't shown up at his workplace. I was taken aback. This had never happened before. Worried that he might have been in an accident, I hurriedly called Thomas. But there was no sign of connection. While pacing restlessly, everything became clear when I stepped into the living room. On the living room table lay a piece of paper. It was a divorce application, already filled out by Thomas. The moment I saw it, I checked the place where I had put away the debit card yesterday, suspecting as much. Sure enough, both the debit card and the personal identification documents were missing.
Astonishing!
I muttered to myself, sighing. It wasn't an accident or an incident. Thomas had likely disappeared on his own. Reflecting back, I realized he had been doing something in the living room since morning. Thomas, who had stolen those items, probably intended to leave me and start a new life. The reason he hadn't driven me away wasn't because it was too late, but because he was aiming for my parents' inheritance. The stolen debit card was proof of that. Yet, I remained calm. Or rather, there was no need to panic. I slowly filled out the divorce certificate and went to proceed with the formalities. Thomas had brought this upon himself. It was time to make him fully realize that regret comes too late. I properly informed Thomas's workplace.
I can't get in touch with him either, but it doesn't seem like an accident. I will notify you as soon as I can. Sorry for the inconvenience.
I apologized. The people at his workplace said they would consider it a day off for now, and I envied Thomas for having such a supportive workplace. After all, it was a company introduced by my parents. I hoped he would be sincere towards his workplace, but he's a stranger to me now. Afterwards, I successfully submitted the divorce application. All this time I had endured, and now I was free so easily. I wondered if a different life would have been possible had I divorced sooner. I was packing things to take with me when my mobile phone rang. It was Thomas, who hadn't answered when I called. I knew what he would say. I ignored it and continued packing. But the phone kept ringing over and over. Eventually, even the landline started ringing. Probably Thomas, but it was so annoying that I decided to answer. Hello? Casually, and as expected, Thomas's panicked voice came from the other end.
Elizabeth?
From the other end. Yes.
I called because they said you didn't show up for work. I've already notified your workplace. This isn't the time for that.
Thomas didn't listen to my words. Cutting me off in a loud voice, he said,
"I can't withdraw any money."
Hearing that, I couldn't help but burst out laughing. He finally realized. I can't help but think so. He must not have noticed because he took them in a hurry.
Well, you would think so. The debit card from the bank account you took, you burned it, remember? Oh. Don't remember? It was in the bag I used for pottery class.
I answered, laughing. Thomas seemed flustered.
Then this card is probably the debit card from Margaret's bank account with no balance left?
I wouldn't know. Mother-in-law Margaret's. I had repeatedly asked Thomas to handle it. I went to the bank to process it, but they said it couldn't be done since I wasn't the heir. Thus, the bank account was left with just a few tens of dollars untouched. The debit card was also tucked away as it was.
Don't joke around. Things belonging to someone who's not here should be properly sorted out. You are the one who said to leave it in there since you'd go at some point. Don't blame others. So what do we do with this debit card for the bank account?
Thomas complained at my words. There's not much to do unless you are going to do it yourself. However, I had no desire to respond and remained silent. Unable to bear it, Thomas seemed to have gone back to the teller, explaining the situation to the bank staff.
It seems I've accidentally burned the card. Can anything be done on her behalf? Look, I'm on the phone with my wife right now.
It seemed he had put it on speaker mode, and I could also hear the troubled voice of the teller. I questioned his words.
Thomas, what are you talking about? You know it's impossible for you to do anything like that for someone else. The divorce papers were processed just earlier. Thanks for preparing them. Goodbye then.
I said what I wanted to say and hung up the phone. Surely the teller must have heard that too. Imagining whether Thomas was turning pale or red at this moment made me almost laugh. Thinking I should leave the house before he returns, I hurriedly packed my bags. And then I left the house. My destination was the vacant family home after my parents passed away. Actually, I had inherited that house as well. The assets of my mother, who had been a business owner, amounted to $13 million. However, inheriting a large sum of cash with no children and potentially falling into Thomas's hands wouldn't be good. Therefore, I inherited just $1 million to live without trouble, and the rest were the family home, my mother's jewelry, beautifully preserved, and my father's antiques. All of which, if appraised, could fetch a considerable amount, were left to me as heirlooms. Of course, I had obtained permission from my brother, Donald. Donald, who had moved out after getting married, was worried about the house becoming vacant and was grateful that someone would inherit the cash since he had children and had taken over the family business. This way, we had peacefully completed the inheritance through discussions. After arriving at the family home, I informed Donald that I had divorced Thomas and would be living there. If you live in the family home, it won't become vacant, and that's a relief. But are you sure about divorcing Thomas? Are you really okay with that, Elizabeth?
Yes, we have no children, and both our parents have passed away. If both parties want a divorce, then it's for the best. I want to restart my life and have no regrets.
Donald was concerned about me being alone. Living as Thomas's maid for a lifetime would be worse. If I could spend the last of my days in this house where I grew up with my family, even alone, it would be happiness. Thomas kept calling many times after that. But, confused as he might be, he didn't think I was in the family home and didn't come to visit. I spent the day alone, quietly. The house without family was indeed lonely, but I felt deeply relieved from the bottom of my heart. The next day, I managed to get up to go for the transfer. The debit card was with Thomas. It was a bit of a hassle to retrieve it, but assuming Thomas would be sleeping, I went to take it back around 6 a.m. When I returned home and opened the door, the smell of alcohol hit my nose so strongly that I grimaced. Entering the living room, beer bottles were messily placed around. In addition, my bank account documents were torn and left on the table. Terrible. No matter how upset one might be, it's no reason to treat someone's bank account documents like this. I gathered them and put them into my bag. I also took a few more clothes and returned home once more. Then, I headed to the bank. There, I was approached at the entrance. Elizabeth.
Thomas.
Surprisingly, Thomas had been lying in wait for me.
Since the table was cleared up, I figured you'd come. It's none of your business whether I come here or not.
Don't say that.
We've lived together as a couple for years.
Even though the divorce was finalized, he still dared to say such things. Ignoring him, I entered the bank. Thomas continued trying to appease me by my side. But I steadfastly ignored him. That's when it happened.
Thomas, Elizabeth.
Someone called out to us.
Matthew, why are you here?
It was Thomas's brother, Matthew. Both Thomas and I were surprised by this unexpected reunion. Matthew had almost been estranged, seeing him only at funerals. Having been married to Thomas for about 40 years, this was only the third time we met. He seemed to have wanted to cut ties, but Thomas's parents had insisted he show up for major family events to avoid scandal over their son's estrangement. We had last seen him at Margaret's funeral a few years ago, so our interactions were minimal, but he recognized us.
I came for Mom's inheritance to check the balance and thought I should inform you both.
Mom's? Thomas's eyes sparkled. I was surprised as well. I thought it was just a few dollars left in Margaret's bank account, but according to Matthew, there were also investment trusts and a safe deposit box Stephen had rented during his lifetime that had been processed a long time ago and forgotten. Matthew, who had been told about these. Margaret before she passed away.
He had been busy and only now got around to it.
I received a call from him, but it seems like he's busy with various things now. But Matthew looked apologetically at Thomas and me.
What is it? There was a letter in the safe deposit box along with the jewelry. Mom wrote that all her assets should go to Elizabeth.
I was taken aback by Matthew's words. Thomas seemed even more shocked than I was. Matthew pulled out a letter from the file he had organized. That notepaper looked familiar. I recognized the stationery because I had bought it for Margaret. The letter clearly stated that the jewelry in the safe deposit box and all other assets were to be bequeathed to her daughter-in-law, me. I remembered Margaret's earnest effort in writing it.
A letter? Shall I bring it out?
I had been coldly told.
It's none of your business.
Coldly told. Perhaps this was what she was referring to at that time. I covered my mouth in shock. Elizabeth has been taking care of the caregiving alone, right? I'm sorry for being mean, it read. Don't let Thomas know, tell Matthew to handle it. Thomas, next to me, started trembling with frustration, his face turning bright red.
Well, I never intended to inherit anyway, but as a legal heir, I thought I had to proceed. It's fine since it's just changing to Elizabeth's name, right?
Matthew said it as if it were nothing. He didn't know we had divorced. Later, I was called to the counter. Thomas seemed too drained to follow. Without much to do, he sat down in the lobby. I completed all necessary tasks that day, the debit card reissuance, the payment to the funeral company, and various changes.
I'll be going ahead then. Elizabeth, I'll contact you again.
Leaving Matthew and a stunned Thomas behind, I successfully returned to my family home. Matthew contacted me formally again later. Thomas had ranted about the letter being invalid. Respect Mom's wishes. But Matthew persuaded him. Failing to convince an unsatisfied Thomas, they ended up consulting a lawyer for free advice. While Margaret's letter couldn't be considered an official will, they were persuaded that it was better to settle things through discussion than hiring a lawyer and incurring fees. Thomas agreed to inherit the house. The investment trusts weren't of significant value, and he reluctantly gave up on the jewelry. Thus, I formally received Margaret's inheritance.
If Elizabeth gets Mom's inheritance, I should get Sarah's, right?
Thomas had said to the lawyer, but that was a different matter. Embarrassing. Even after being calmed down by the lawyer, Thomas, unsatisfied, finally found out I was in the family home and came to our house. I was wrong. Let's start over. Realizing he couldn't get any money, he stood at the front door, hoping for a remarriage.
You say let's start over, but there was never any love between us to begin with. What is there to redo?
For the first time, I expressed the feelings I had always wanted to tell Thomas. Thomas, for once, was silent, unable to say anything. It seemed he was filled with regret, and I couldn't help but smile slightly.
Well, at least you still have the house. Oh, have you contacted your workplace? If you're that desperate for money, you better work seriously. Make sure you don't lose your job.
With that, I closed the door on him. It was finally over. My bank account was left to me by both our mothers. With that, I knew I could live comfortably without any troubles in the future. Thomas, after that, continued to be despondent, failed to contact his workplace, and with his continued unexplained absences, he was eventually fired. I warned him. Having lost even his passion for the only thing he was good at, what was left for him? Looking back, maybe his dedication to work wasn't about responsibility, but about maintaining his own dignity. Now, without anyone to show that dignity to, without the easy money he thought he'd get, it wouldn't be surprising if he felt he had lost his reason to live. He was someone I lived with as a spouse for many years. Of course, I'm concerned. But that's all. I have no intention of helping him.
I'm really sorry for all the trouble caused to you, Elizabeth.
Matthew was the only one who knew everything and apologized to me. He also said I didn't need to deal with Thomas anymore. Realizing the family's abnormalities early on, he left home at a young age. Thanks to him, I believe he's living happily now without involving his family with that house. I heard Thomas has become a recluse, but he's at an age where he can receive a pension, so he should be able to manage somehow. He had the audacity to say we should start over. He can try starting over by himself if he wants. Afterward, I began attending pottery classes again. My friends were happy about my return, and I never realized how enjoyable it could be to spend time just for myself. I even met someone wonderful at the pottery class. I'm done with marriage. I'm starting to think that being with someone who loves me might be happier than staying alone forever. There's a part of me that feels it's too late, but just like with the divorce, it's never too late as long as you're alive. Anyone can find happiness, no matter their age. That's what I believe.